In this fourth part, we're going to see how Revelation takes us from Jesus' victory in chapter 11 to the final victory in chapter 20. We've covered the basic teachings in Revelation 6 to 11. We've also talked about Revelation 20. So today we're going to zoom in on the 8 chapters in between. Now in chapter 12, Jesus' ascension has brought about a struggle between God's people and Satan's people. In chapter 13, the sinner's camp is described, and it is characterized by violence, lies, and coercion. And then in chapter 14, the saints' camp is described, and the saints would cleanse God's earth together with Jesus. In the middle 2 chapters is God's wrath. God's wrath is his consistent righteousness. And then eventually, sinners get what they deserve. And in chapter 17, how the sinners' camp would end up destroying itself is being described. And in chapter 18, how is Babylon destroyed is also described. And in chapter 19, everything is brought to a close. After the initial struggle in chapter 12, chapter 19 would conclude all this struggle. And we want to ask the question, what does the wrath of God do to the sinners' camp on earth? And we want to compare chapter 13 and chapter 17. In chapter 13, we see that Satan has delegated his authority to the beast. And there is a political beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. And this beast is terrorizing the people. And then there is the religious beast deceiving the people. And there is another group, the populace, going about their everyday business of buying and selling, yet they are controlled by the beast. In Revelation 17, we see that there is a great harlot. Now, this great harlot, Babylon, has not committed adultery, because in an adulterous situation, the people simply have loved the wrong person, okay? But a harlot or prostitute loves nobody except himself or herself. And Babylon is not an adulterer or an adulteress. Babylon is the great prostitute, and she pollutes the entire world through her immorality. And we'll find out what that is. And this seems to correspond to the populace doing the buying and selling, yet controlled by the beast. And then there is one beast mentioned in Revelation 17, and this beast seems to have merged both the political and the religious beast of Revelation 13. And the populace is being marked 666 in this camp in Revelation 13. It's interesting that Revelation specifically says that it requires wisdom to understand what this 666 is. And this is the first mention of wisdom in Revelation. The other mention of wisdom in Revelation is here in Revelation 17. Why does it require wisdom to understand? Because when people see the beast and see how mighty the beast seems to be, they would think that the beast would last a long time or even would last forever. However, wisdom recognizes that this power is very transient and it will go to destruction very shortly, in 1 hour. Now here, we want to understand why 666 would bring about this result. Because in the Bible, 7 would be God's Sabbath. It brings you ultimate satisfaction, ultimate rest. 6 would remain at the threshold of this rest, never entering this rest. So in the political arena, there's no rest. In the religious arena, there's no rest. And in the everyday arena, there's no rest. This would be 6, 6, and 6. That would cause constant agitation leading to irrational, deadly violence. And that is expressed as Babylon being killed by the beast. Now, why would the beast kill Babylon? The beast is dependent on Babylon because Babylon is the economic, social base of the beast. And it would be suicidal for the beast to kill Babylon. But this has happened. This is what the Bible is describing, that this will be irrational and it will lead to their downfall. And yet this self-destruction is attributed to God fulfilling his words. So how will the sinners camp end? The sinners camp will self-destruct. Now, we ask the next question. What does the wrath of God do to Babylon through the saints? We want to look at chapter 14 and chapter 18. Here, in chapter 14, the saints are having a sweet fellowship with the Lamb on Mount Zion. And then they proclaim a 3-point eternal gospel. The first point is that fear the Creator who will judge. The second point is that Babylon has fallen. The third point is a call to come out of Babylon. Otherwise, misery will overtake those who remain. Now, in Revelation 18, we see immediately that the earth is illuminated by the glory of an angel from heaven. What would be the result? They would see that God is the creator of this beautiful earth, of this wonderful earth. And they would also recognize that God would judge them for how they deal with this earth. And then the second point is almost repeated verbatim from Revelation 14, Babylon has fallen. And then the third point brought out in Revelation 18 is that people should not participate in Babylon's sin. They should come out, and then they can avoid the miseries with Babylon's collapse. And this is exactly the third point of the eternal gospel. So with that, we see another scenario being played out. The saints would call out to the Son of Man and to each other to cleanse the earth. And the earth is cleansed, and this cleansing act is considered God's wrath. And in Revelation 18, we see that this is elaborated. Babylon's downfall will be proportional to her pride and will come swiftly. In 1 hour, Babylon would fall, and all her great wealth would be no more, and all that she longed for will vanish. Okay, and this is irreversible. It will be permanent. And then in chapter 14, the saints are assured that their works will follow them. Why? This can only happen if God wins. So if God has completed the destruction of Babylon, which is the sum total of all sins and sinners, when Babylon is completely destroyed, then the cause of the saints is vindicated, and their works will follow them. So what shape will this cleansing take? This cleansing will come about because people will reject Babylon for the eternal gospel. Now then, let us take a look at Revelation 12 and 19. See how the beginning and the end would unfold. In the beginning, there are some time scales, 1,260 days, time, times, and half a time. In Revelation 19, there's no more time scale. There's 4 hallelujahs. In Revelation 12, the dragon attempts to murder the infant. However, in chapter 19, the infant is the faithful and true, that is Jesus, on his white horse. Now, in chapter 12, the infant is to rule with a rod of iron, and this infant is removed to heaven. In chapter 19, Jesus will smite and rule the nation with a rod of iron. And then in chapter 12, the woman would flee to the wilderness to be nourished. In chapter 19, this woman has become Christ's bride. And then in Revelation 12, Satan was accusing the brethren, but the brethren are given the winning formula to overcome Satan. Here, the brethren are now on their own victorious white horses. And then in Revelation 12, the woman will fly to the wilderness, the same godly woman, to be nourished. And here in 19, the saints are called to feast on the spoil of war. And then in Revelation 12, the dragon continues to attack. However, in chapter 19, any resistance to God would be killed by the sword from Jesus' mouth. So how will all this end? God's truth is once again reestablished in his creation. Now, let us zoom in on God's wrath and see what it would do to things on the ground. Now, first of all, we see that God's wrath would destroy the unrepentant. They would self-destruct. And then God's wrath has another aspect. It transforms the repentant so that the evil structure is destroyed. And this brings us from the beginning of the struggle to the end of the struggle. Now, God's wrath is consistent, and is his consistent righteousness when viewed from the other angle. So in chapter 16, it says, "It is done." And then we see that the great city, which is Babylon, is split into 3 parts. 2 parts would be the beast and some parts of Babylon, non-repentant part of Babylon, and sinners would self-destruct here. And these 2 parts are destroyed. And the final part would be the destruction of the evil structure with the repentance of former Babylonians. So let us then zoom in on this divine wrath further. The wrath of God is consistent because the Song of Moses and the Song of the Lamb are being sung together as one song. And then, this is a very important point, once the wrath of God comes about, there's no turning back. So this is a very clear warning for us not to take the patience of God for granted, because then the temple which people can enter to petition God is no more accessible because of the smoke. And then comes the seven bowls of wrath. In the first four bowls, we see that things are building up to a point of no return. And yet, I just have to point out that this wrath of God is never on creation. Creation is simply a conduit for God's wrath. God is never angry with his creation. God is only angry with sinners. And so if we go further, they have crossed a point of no return because the kingdom of the beast is darkened. They cannot see their way out of the situation. They cannot see the way back to God. And then the sixth bowl would see kings from the east would come and fight in the war of Armageddon. But who are these people or kings from the east? If we go back to Genesis, we'll see that after Adam and Eve sinned, they went east. After Cain killed his brother, he went east. And after people came out of the ark, they went further east. They have now become kings. They have power. They now want to return, either to reclaim Eden or to recreate an Eden without God for themselves. They're setting themselves up for self-destruction, which is described as Armageddon. Armageddon is not God fighting against these sinners, but rather is their own self-destruction. What does the seventh bowl say? Their hailstones proportional to the wage of the sins would fall on their heads. Now these hailstones are about 1 talent each. How heavy is 1 talent? 1 talent is the silver equivalent of the wage of an average worker over one's lifetime. Okay, so all the sins would aggregate and become a hailstone and would fall back on the heads of the sinners. So how does God complete his wrath? God would destroy the greed structure, the structure that enables greed, because greed is at the foundation of a lot of sins, human sins. And so God has destroyed this evil structure, and that is the final aspect of God's wrath. And that, once onset, is irreversible, and we have to be very clear about that. So, having said all this, how are these 8 chapters related? Now, in chapter 11, we see that the Lord of the Sabbath has won the ultimate victory, and thereafter the battle line is drawn between the 2 camps. That is in Revelation 12. And then we see eventually, with the destruction of the sinners' camp and Babylon being the sum total of sins and sinners, have been destroyed. that completes the destruction of the opposition to God. And then in chapter 20, everyone will have to choose side, and they will be judged by whether they have aligned with God, hence with the saints' camp, or aligned with Satan, the beast, and Babylon to destroy God's creation. And for this, they will be judged by God. And that is in Revelation 20.